Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alysha Alani, and I have the honor of welcoming you to today's program, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, Living Heritage. This evening's event, discusses cultural heritage and displacement of people from their native lands. The BSA and the panelist organizations collectively recognize that each of us on this call today are speaking from the ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treated and some unceded. Sessions like this provide an opportunity for awareness and understanding. Today's event is the fourth and final webinar in the series Architecture in Dialogue, which celebrates the 14th cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. The series is hosted by the Boston Society for Architecture and the Aga Khan Council USA, with support from the Boston Society of Landscape Architects and the MIT Department of Architecture. At the Aga Khan Award prize-giving ceremony in 2019, His Highness the Aga Khan said, quote, "A true dialogue requires not only that we articulate one perspective, but also that we listen attentively to other perspectives. More than that, it asks us not only to listen to one another, but also to learn from one another," end quote. With that in mind, thank you for being here, for listening, and for learning along with us. Tonight, we'll hear from our esteemed panelists, Dr. Azra Akšamija and Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis, and end with Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to submit questions in the chat or through the Q&A function anytime throughout the evening. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Azra Akšamija is an artist and architectural historian specializing in art and architecture of Islamic societies. She is an associate professor in the MIT Department of Architecture program in Art, Culture, and Technology, where she directs the Future Heritage Lab. Dr. Akšamija holds 2 master's degrees and a PhD in history, theory, and criticism in architecture. She received the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2013 for her art installation in the prayer space in the Islamic cemetery in Alta, Austria. Also with us today is Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis, the director and CEO of the Aga Khan Museum located in Toronto, Canada. With over 20 years of experience as a curator and senior advisor for museum and cultural projects and a PhD in Islamic art, Dr. Al-Khamis has worked with institutions, including the National Museums of Scotland. More recently, she served as co-director at the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization, as well as senior strategic advisor to the Sharjah Museum's department in the United Arab Emirates. Thank you to both of our speakers for sharing their time, their knowledge, and expertise with us. And with that, Dr. Akšamija, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alysha, and welcome everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm really grateful to our organizers to host us tonight. We have around 1 hour time. We'll try to keep it to 50 minutes to leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A. I will start with my screen share. Okay, we have a lot to go through, but first, for those of you who don't know anything about the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, just brief information. It is a program of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, which is a philanthropic organization that supports a wide range of activities aimed at preservation and promotion of material and spiritual heritage of Muslim societies. It was established by His Highness the Aga Khan in 1977. It is a triennial award, and it is regarded one of the most important honors in the field of architecture. It is granted to projects that not only celebrate architectural excellence, but also improve the overall quality of life of their surrounding communities. And with that, we mean not only Muslim communities, but it is given to those societies that have a significant Muslim presence. So the tonight event is organized as a celebration also of the Aga Khan Award 17 to 19 cycle. We'll just take out a couple of projects and we will be drawing on the themes from these projects to talk about displacement and heritage of forcefully displaced people. The first project I would like to bring out from the 2019 cycle is the Vaset Wetlands Center in the Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, which was designed in 2012. It takes around 200,000 square meters. The client was Environment and Protected Areas Authority in Sharjah, United Emirates, and the architects were ex-architects in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. This project was part of the wider Sharjah's initiative to clean up and rehabilitate an area that used to be quite a wasteland. And the Vaset Wetlands Center aims to supply information and education about this very unique environmental project and to encourage preservation. So what the architects did here was quite unique. The project represents an approach to architecture that's not necessarily only human-centric. They cleaned and purified the area in terms of water. Some of the non-native plants were replaced by native plants, which then attracted a large number of native migratory birds to settle in. And in this way, architecture, the project brings nature and people together in a kind of harmonic coexistence. And this is quite a unique and important perspective, thinking about challenges of climate change and all the kind of future displacement and problems that our planetary community will face. Another theme that we will draw on comes from the Palestinian Museum, a unique museum that was designed in 2012 to 2013 by Aga Khan architects from Dublin, Ireland. It celebrates Palestinian heritage and with the aim to foster cultural dialogue and tolerance, as the architects stated. It is a flagship of the Palestinians' largest NGO, the Taboon Welfare Association, which is the client for this project. What is very interesting about this project, it got a number of sustainability awards, local materials were used, but also again, this theme of nature was brought in as a form of living heritage. Agricultural landscape comes very close to the very walls of the museum to draw in the audience, but also to promote, for example, the living heritage of Palestinians through food. But the institution itself is very important given the context of this largely displaced community and an ongoing occupation happening on their land. So drawing from these themes, we will, in this presentation, bring in some of our own projects and activities from the Aga Khan Museum. I would like to bring in the Islamic cemetery Alta in Austria, and designed by architect Bernardo Bader in 2012, which received the Aga Khan Award in 2013. And I was fortunate to be part also of this project. This cemetery is quite unique, again, also in this bringing nature and architecture, humans from different cultural backgrounds together. It is unique also as a statement for coexistence. It is a project that enabled Muslim community living in Austria, which has been recognized for more than 100 years as an equal religious community, to be buried according to Islamic rite, which was not possible up to that moment. And a new law had to be introduced to enable Islamic burials. And architecture in a way facilitated that. There was a process that needed to gather community. In this case, in Vorarlberg, it is a group of Muslims who come from very different backgrounds, Turkish community who came in the 60s and 70s, and then in the 80s and 90s, Chechens and Yugoslav from the former Yugoslav Republic in the wake of Yugoslav wars. So you have these very diverse, culturally and religiously diverse groups finding a common problem, where to bury their dead and find the place of final rest. And they collaborated closely with the Catholic Church the Jewish Museum, which produced documentation and kind of rationale to enable the construction of this cemetery, and make a point that this is needed for this area. I was fortunate to get invited by the city of Alta and the architect Bernardo Bader to design the more symbolic side of the cemetery, the masjid, which is not necessarily a mosque, but was found to be an important symbolic element for this first Islamic cemetery in the region. And I came up with a proposal that promotes the notion of transcultural aesthetic. How do you visually and through materials enable a living heritage of these displaced communities, but in an environment that is, that doesn't have a long cultural history of these communities, and how can architecture facilitate that bridge? So here we see an aesthetic bridge through sensory experience of space, the use of local materials, like these wooden shingles for which Vorarlberg is known for. I hung these shingles on a kind of stainless steel curtain to break the light, they stage the light in a very particular way. You see the reflections on the ground that state Allah and Muhammad as people are praying and kind of animate the space, and the prayer carpets that create a certain depth in space. That these carpets were woven by Bosnian women who were victims of torture, survivors of torture during the Balkan War. So there's this additional symbolic element in the mosque supporting the healing, let's say, of these communities back home. What the Aga Khan Award did here was to acknowledge not only a kind of architectural excellence, but the project of finding homeland. For Muslims in this region, architecture or cemeteries, so to say, a symbol that Austria has become a place where they want to find their final rest. So it's not anymore a place where you came from, where you used to ship your dead in very complicated and expensive circumstances, but where you want to find the final resting, and how that looks like was something that was quite well mediated politically, but also achieved aesthetically through this project. This kind of project is very important statement against the polarizing discussion that is happening in many countries in Western Europe. In Austria, it's quite strong anti-Islamic sentiment still ongoing. And a lot of the kind of, well, I would say, really chauvinistic and anti-Islamic sentiments are packaged into architectural arguments, for prohibiting construction of minarets, discussions about veiling of women. So it's a lot of it is about representation. And what the Islamic cemetery in Alta did was to move that discussion from iconography to a sensory experience of space that connects people on a kind of human level. They come into this space, and many visitors here are not just users of these Muslim communities, but just non-Muslim Austrians come here en masse to learn about Islamic cultures and their burial rites and death, so to say. We come close. For me, this kind of project, and I got to it based on my kind of long time work in the area of politics of representation of Muslims in the West, through my projects that I called Wearable Masters. There's a series of them where I designed these clothes that open up and become minimal prayer spaces, portable temples, let's say, portable mosques, mini spaces for 1 or 2 people. This particular example, I call it the Dirndl Moschee, is inspired by the Austrian traditional costume and the famous Renaissance Pacha altar, which unfolds into 3. So referencing this, I created something that signals the complexity of belonging and impossibility of belonging to multiple cultural milieus. Finally, this kind of introduction of shared, the transcultural aesthetics, I think, is an important vehicle that architecture can provide to counter this polarization that we are witnessing in politicization and criminalization of those who are forcefully displaced. And I would like to put this question into our discussion today. How do we intervene in these ongoing crises that we are also part of through our consumer behavior and being part of the global community? Where do we place our agency as architects in the kind of material reconstruction of that was destroyed, or into also reconstructing society through other means? I will pause here and give the word also to Ulrike to join me.
Thank you so much, Azra. If you move on to the next slide, I wanted to pick up on the conversation that Azra started with, a focus on an interplay between architecture, societies, and the environment, with an aim to really improving quality of life and also engendering positive intercultural cohabitation and societies. And of course, one thing we should keep in mind in that respect is that while when we think of architecture, generally consider built-up static structures and environments, there are many parts of the world where mobile architecture has always played a very crucial and integral part of life, and in particular, of course, tentage. Now, when we think of tents in the West, we think of camping, we think of weddings, but we owe this tradition actually to the Muslim world, because the whole tradition of tents actually was introduced into Europe in particular from the Muslim world. But we do not necessarily remember so much that the use of the tent as a form of mobile architecture with very, very specific mobile architectural features, and also with very important social patterns and social relationships attached to them, continue to be a very important part of contemporary life from Africa to South Asia and Central Asia. And of course, visions of tents bring on the one hand certainly ideas of the black tents of the Bedouin in the Arab world, woven from black goat hair, with narrow panels woven by the women of the tribes and then affixed together to each other and supported by ropes and auxiliary poles. And of course, further into Central Asia, trellis tents that have a support structure, circular support structure, covered by felt, made from sheep's wool and designed really to be resistant to extreme climatic situations, both in the summer and in the winter, but also able to fend off unexpected and not so friendly human encounters. And these kind of tents, particularly the yurt, are attested within the Muslim world from the 13th century onwards. We have many historical sources that talk about the royal tents, in particular of the Mongols that ruled much of Asia across the centuries from the early 13th century onwards, then to be replaced by the rulership of Timur in the early 15th century. And this tradition led to a very sophisticated hierarchical arrangement where the royal tent really became the locus of royal power, of an idea of paradise on earth, and a tool with which to even mark hierarchies, relative hierarchies in encampments. And from the structural point of view, the outside tended to be very, very plain. You see here the yurt that we own in the museum, and that was pitched last in 2018, straight from Mongolia, made by traditional Mongolian craftsmen. And traditionally, the inside would then be decorated with very, very specific and symbol-laden textiles, brocades, woven textiles, depending on the rank of the owner of the tent. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. So these kind of trellis tents could take different shapes and different forms, and many of them actually had veritable domes above the circular structure. And this beautiful miniature painting from the 1520s from Tabriz in Iran shows you such a phenomenal tent. But what is fascinating here is that the painter has actually shown the inside of this tent. What you are looking at is not the elevation, the external elevation, but is giving you the inside of the tent with the lady Shirin, in this case, a famous Persian princess, looking out from her tent onto the happenings in the landscape in which she finds herself. And what you can see here is a reference to these really spectacular textiles that were used to decorate the dome, often with patterns and visual references to the heavens, because as I said, the royal tents in particular were seen as heaven on earth and had direct references to the paradise to come. And then even the walls are surrounded by very, very special, specially woven textiles of silks, of brocades. Often there were added decorations with jewels and pearls, again, depending on the status of the owner of the tent. And interestingly, the designs and the symbolism in these tents reflected immediately those that would also have been found in the royal or princely or imperial built-up palaces back in the cities from which these rulers also ruled, because into the modern period, the ruling elites of countries like Iran and other areas in Central Asia would move between their built-up palace cities and their tent cities in the vast expanses of the empires that they ruled, and would always make sure that the symbolism that surrounded them in the city would be replicated in the appropriate fashion in any kind of semi-permanent camp environment. Next one, please, Azra. Now, these kind of tents were never really pitched in isolation. They were always part of larger encampments, royal encampments, military encampments, of course. And here I have a miniature again from Iran from the later 16th century, where you see the kind of different tents that might be pitched in such an enclosure. We see again the domed trellis tent I referred to earlier, but then on the right you also see a different tent design with an awning held up by a central pole and back panels to protect the ruler, Alexander the Great in this case, who is seated and talking to a guest. And on the extreme left, you can see a sheltering panel that may have been part of an enclosure, because within an encampment, each tent, particularly those of the ruler, his family, his elite, would have been enclosed by specially designed enclosures to ensure privacy, but also ensure added protection. Next, please. Now, as I said, tents belong to encampments, and we have in the museum a wonderful plan which comes from Afghanistan, is dated around 1800, where you can see how such a royal encampment would once have looked like. And this is indeed a practical plan for a team of pitchers that would have gone ahead of the royal entourage in order to erect the tent city in anticipation of the ruler and the officials and their entourage arriving. So every tent in this beautiful drawing has a particular shape, a particular color. It has an inscription that tells you exactly whose tent it is, for what purpose it is meant. And of course, these tent cities had not only the personal tents for the personalities that would live in the encampment, but they would also have bazaars, they would have mosques, they would have harem areas for the ladies that were traveling, there would be the finance tent, there would be the royal atelier tent on those occasions where artists traveled with the entourage, and every single tent here is denoted for its purpose and for its owner. And as you can see, the tents are all organized with an orientation towards the center, which has a viewing post for the guards in the middle of the camp. So everyone could look over the enclosure of the encampment and make sure that no enemies were approaching. And if you look very, very closely, you can also see that while some of the tents only have one level of coverage and awning, some of the larger tents have several levels of awnings, and they were specially designed to maximize airflow, to maximize protection from the sun, to direct the wind away or towards, depending on the climate. So very sophisticated structures that were carefully thought out, both in terms of their physical function and service for the people that used them, but also really very much in reference to the social interrelationships of the people that were in this tent city. This is really something to keep in mind, because the concept of the tent city that sadly we have today is really reflected mainly in the tent cities of the refugees and the displaced people that the aid agencies all around the world have to deal with. And of course, this is a topic that Azra in her newer work has been exploring in terms of both the structural elements and individual features of the tent concept, as it were, but also very much in relationship with the people who have to live in these tents. And these are the now roughly 85 million displaced people that we have around the world at this point in time. So with that, I hand it over back to you, Azra.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for this keyword and bringing the history into this conversation. And from the themes of living heritage from the Aga Khan Award to the history of the tent, we come to the contemporary tent cities that Ulrike had mentioned. And I would like to talk about this subject through a project that we are currently exhibiting at the Venice Architecture Biennale. You see an image of that from the Arsenale. The project or this installation is called Displaced Empire. It is a product of a long collaboration between members of the Future Heritage Lab at MIT, our colleagues, architects, designers in Jordan, and Syrian refugees, inventors, designers who live in Azraq and Zaatari refugee camps. This particular installation was fully produced by my team at MIT and Jordanian colleagues, but I will show work that we have also done and that remained in the camps themselves. This installation is called Displaced Empire as a kind of provocation to think about the world that we live in now, but through the lens of a future, a speculation of the future that is imagining a world. If we go with the speed of forced displacement, soon there will be more displaced people than sedentary people in the world. And what that world might be, what is kind of power relationships, if we imagine all of ourselves actually being displaced at some point, but also with the idea that the heritage that we produce today and these 10 cities, they are the heritage of the future. So this tent that we call the T Serai, which is an acronym for Textile System for Experiments and Research and Artistic Impact, is a hybrid of the cutting edge of the humanitarian shelter we have today that you see on the top left, the so-called T shelter that is mass-produced in Jordanian refugee camps, and the historical Ottoman portable palace in which the Sultan would meet and greet different delegations. And this piece is a commentary on one hand on a kind of inappropriateness of humanitarian architecture that we have today. You see here an image from Azra refugee camp that we took in 2017, where you see a very strong juxtaposition of two concepts of shelter. In the back, the ready-made humanitarian shelter by UNHCR, that is really like the state-of-the-art architectural solution for accommodating refugee arrivals en masse. And then in front, this adobe structure designed by a Syrian man who was kind of gathering and scavenging materials around the camp to recreate something that he sees to be like a true sanctuary, a sanctuary for the mind, let's say, something that is inspired by both Palmyra arches, for example, but also local Jordanian heritage. And so there's the cultural shelter that is positioned here as a kind of more adequate form of shelter that Syrians would design, for example. A brief information about Azra refugee camp. This is the second largest camp in the region, where more than 38,000 Syrian refugees live currently. It is in the middle of nowhere, basically not a single tree is in the area. Usually these camps are placed in very remote locations to kind of also prevent the mingling between host communities and the refugees. Usually this is explained through paradigms of security, but in a way, all across the world, you have these kinds of prisons for refugees, people who were forcefully displaced and have become, so to say, criminalized for losing their history, memory, identity, and everything. So living conditions unbearable here. We see kind of repetitiveness of these shelters, like a horizon feeling, sea of steel, of white steel. And in this kind of landscape, we found people who are incredibly resourceful and creative and who are altering and finding ways to better their life by drawing inspiration from their cultural heritage and trying to kind of resist and persist living through cultural activities, their living heritage, practices, representations, knowledge sharing, expression through written and spoken word. So we met a range of people in these camps, and through various types of activities, research activities, educational and creative workshops, we try to be cautious about the ethics of us coming in and working with people. So these workshops and exchanges were always multi-generational, cross-disciplinary, and transcultural. So there was always international groups together with members of the host community and very diverse Syrian refugee population. And so everyone was kind of contributing something and learning something from the others. So there was a kind of multi-directional knowledge exchange. And what we learned among many things was that a kind of aid that is provided is often considering human needs as a kind of based on biological needs, that you need a roof above your head and food. But when you look at the things that Syrian refugees themselves produce in the middle of, zero resources, a lot of these things are not necessarily utilitarian. Yes, you have a kind of modification of UNHCR lamps and creation of a kind of windmill powered electrical devices, but many are producing toys out of trash, models of the heritage to kind of remember who they are and also to find hope in the future by inspiring young generations to go back to school and learn. In the inside of the houses, it's just incredible how people kind of transform these cold, bare steel shelters into like warm, welcoming environments by, just using core relief items. So here you see wool blankets, creating some sort of majlis, and someone designed this beautiful water fountain that you can actually take apart and use for something else, but you can put together shisha, like hookah or a water pipe together with these plastic buckets to create a functioning water fountain that creates a sense of coolness and pleasant spatial experience in the middle of unbearable heat of the desert. So learning from these inventions of Syrian refugees, we jointly came up with this project that is trying to upcycle trash textiles that are kind of given to the Syrian refugees as a humanitarian donation, partly core relief items and partly clothing donations, as a resource to humanize these unhuman shelters. So this is a photo montage of a kind of textile panel of how this would look. So you basically cut up and layer pieces of fabric, and you slash them to form modular tapestries. Here you see some prototypes that we designed in the Future Heritage Lab, made of jeans and these shock blankets that deflect the sun. And inside you see, like in reference to the Ottoman tents, this beautiful red toned colored fabrics, all cut out from clothes. And you would still see, you see here kind of baby clothes and t-shirts and buttons visible in the fabric. So the one reference here are the Ottoman military tents that, and with this visual reference, we create a kind of prompt to say, okay, what if the refugee is becoming a kind of the powerful one in the future, and there is a refugee empire? What kind of society would that be in? The other is reference are the Egyptian kayamiyya, the tent panels, and a kind of living tradition that is still kept alive in streets of Cairo. These beautiful applique tents that create just intricate patterns and also calligraphy, but also, of course, the shelter transformation by Syrian refugees themselves who use these various textiles given to them to recreate and beautify their living environments as a form of empowerment and continuing their culture. So all these inspirations come together in this installation, Displaced Empire. You see here also in Venice, we displayed banners where we present research in form of drawings, scenes of everyday life representing inventions of everyday life created by Syrian refugees. So the point here is to critique, on the one, use architecture and tent architecture to critique humanitarian state of affairs and also the role of architecture in providing shelter, and to move our thinking beyond this idea that human needs are based on a roof and kind of food, but there are cultural and emotional needs that need to be considered. So, for example, in these shelters, people will use textiles to create different areas of privacy, because this is not considered in, you have an entire family, male, females, children, parents, everyone is in the same space. There is also no storage, so these panels enable possibilities for like mobile storage, decoration, but also embroidering and depicting stories that personifying your living environment. You are not just a number. And possible other applications are to create, social spaces, which also are lacking in these kinds of camps. Usually social space is not something that, they are community centers, but they are shared and they are in demand for different kinds of activities. And so there are just not enough of those. And if they are supervised by the NGOs, so people cannot necessarily use them according to their own ideas. And then thinking about this future heritage, also refugee camps are known to be also a major source of environmental pollution and impact. Not many camps have recycling facilities. This is an image from the Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees, for example, where not only the region is a place of major exploitation through textile industry, but it's also a place where a lot of that discarded clothes get dumped and trashed into the camps. So with this project, we are testing visually and in terms of prototyping how we could draw from history of these applique tent panels to use this trash resource to create new type of heritage and kind of keep the living tradition of the tents and also the social activities surrounding them. So here you see we did that, and a very nice way of actually upcycling these textiles is the reverse applique technique, where you layer pieces of fabric, you sew them together, and then you can kind of cut out the patterns through the seams. And we tested this in various activities. So the tent that you saw was created by my team, but it is just a prototype to inspire people in different places and to bring them together in a conversation. So here you see images of my students at MIT creating textiles that tell story about their cultural heritage or transcultural encounters. Another workshop at the American University in Sharjah. And in these various workshops, students learn about local textile traditions and forms of resistance and a kind of critique and political messages that one could imbue in textiles, but also thinking about sustainability and kind of both in historical terms, like in Japanese boro stitching technique, or the more contemporary work of designers and Aga Khan Award winners like Anna Heringer with the beautiful Dipti textiles in Bangladesh, where they layer fabrics and kind of recycle the saris to create new forms of clothes and blankets. And so what this project is really about is kind of raising awareness about the needs of refugees in the context that surrounding our museum and educational audiences, and exchanging knowledge across borders, bringing students together. This is from American University in Sharjah, where a Palestinian student used her keffiyeh to create a Tisrai tapestry. students to learn about other cultures and share their stories and find what they have in common. I would think, for example, that this is a kind of Islamic inspired design, but in fact it is a student from Iowa who saw this star in an American shopping mall, but then, you know, the resemblance brought him to think about and learn about Islamic geometry. So we create also own spaces for learning here. You know, we created our tent and had the class in it at MIT, and all this work was also exhibited at Tisera exhibition at the Sharjah Museum for Islamic Civilization. So museums here in Sharjah Museum really helped us to do a lot of the actual work back in the refugee camps and support that financially. Here was one important workshop in Zatari refugee camp, where we became part of the youth skill development program of Norwegian Refugee Council, partnered up with them to see how we can maybe inform from this kind of artistic and historical and designerly perspective, vocational training courses that are happening anyway, but instead of kind of training people to become obedient factory workers, maybe they can also learn something creative and express themselves and create something for their homes. And here are some of the results of those workshops. Okay, I will stop here and then bring back the voice to Ulrike to start wrapping up before we go back to our discussion, and maybe we could talk about the role of our institutions in the world that we are facing and how we can amplify a living heritage for the purpose of promoting pluralism.
Happily, thank you so much, Azra. And if you just a beautiful view of our museum here in Toronto, because of course that too is the work of a famous international architect, Fumihiko Maki, Pritzker Prize winning architect, and really a space that again was designed to consider how architecture as an art form, nature and humanity can come together in a conducive, empathetic, and positive way. But the point I really wanted to make, if you go to the next slide and the slide after, is that Azra's work and her thinking about how to utilize the opportunities of mobile architectural elements inspired in particular by tent structures and by ephemeral refuges, really, that people use all around the world. One of the latest collaborations that we did together was around the sanctuary exhibition that we held in the museum last year, and that was based on a collaboration with the Foresight Foundation in San Francisco and incorporated at its heart a collection of contemporary rugs that were designed by international artists around the theme of sanctuary from violence and conflict, sanctuary from psychological torment and torture, and then also sanctuary with an eye on the environment around it and the universe at large being that sanctuary, if only we respect it and allow it to nest us. And Azra very generously agreed to be our exhibition architect. So when you look at the structures that provide the context for the artist rugs, you will see that initially they also were inspired by ephemeral structures that displaced people and refugees draw up around themselves for protection, but that are also mobile and impermanent. But here, Azra took the whole idea and the whole concept one step further still, because the materials that she used to create these impermanent, transigent elevations were made from recycled, shredded t-shirt materials that she then color sorted and created and knotted together to these phenomenal permeable walls that you see here. And that, to me, incidentally, Azra always reminded me of birds that are soaring into the skies seeking freedom. So that was a wonderful byproduct. But the most important point that Azra wanted to make here is that there are so many people on the move today, in part because of the disrespect of humanity towards the environment, towards nature, and the catastrophic fallout of climate change that we have to live with every single day nowadays. And she really took this T-shirt aspect to explore the various forms of exploitation that come through the mass production and mass use of resources at our disposal. Azra, do you want to say a little bit more about it from your end?
Well, maybe just one thought that the architecture not only is weaving together with these carpets through the kind of reference to the loom, but to bring in the museum constituency, in this case, members of the museum audience were asked to bring their own t-shirts and participate in the making of this show. And the entire exhibition, that was fascinating to me, actually. What you guys did was everything was recycled. Not even, I mean, they didn't even get the vinyl lettering. They hired a calligrapher to do, and I think to do the exhibition texts, for example. And here with the t-shirt, this materiality of the show brings to mind all of our responsibility in shaping the future of the world that we are part, and what we wear. Just a stupid cheap t-shirt that you wear has a huge impact and produces these refugees that we were talking about on a kind of global scale, and we are all part of it, and we need to kind of be reminded of that. And I think that's partly also our role, to not just preach and go somewhere, but really like question our own behavior.
And our work as well, because the curator of that show, Dr. Michael Chagnon, was the one who really championed the deep consideration of environmental issues in conjunction with this original exhibition concept. And this is something that all of us in our work today, in arts and culture, in architecture, really are contemplating every single day. How do we make our work truly relevant to our audiences? How do we find ways to be part of the discourse of today? How do we empower voices and showcase voices that are not heard in the mainstream discourse? How do we bring cultures together and bridge cultures through the skills we have, through the opportunities and resources we have? How do we share ideas and skills with peoples who may not have immediate access to education, to resources, to ways in which to unlock the potential that people have? And Azra, more than I do, knows how much phenomenal potential is hidden away in the refugee camps of this world. So really, we are moving away from a traditional, conventional viewpoint that may be more introspective, and consider how we can take what we have at our disposal and really make it available for the service of communities out there, our audiences, and ultimately a better world. So it's an urgency we all feel, and it really also in my personal case, considers the museum as a space that is a community hub. And if you go to the next slide, that goes beyond, you know, artistic exhibitions or artistic projects, and really makes itself available to the community also in times of need. We really recently had a COVID a pop-up clinic in our park outside the museum to really help drive the vaccination efforts here in Toronto. And it's quite neat that this photo too has a tent in it, where the guests that received the vaccinations could rest after they had taken their shot. So coming back to the notion that mobile architecture too can have enormous value for communities and enormous symbolism of good and positive social change.
Thank you, Ulrike. Such beautiful final words. I will just, to bring it back to the themes of the living heritage and displacement, I would like our audience to invite you to engage in this dialogue and ask us questions, please. We will take them in the chat, but also to look at the two upcoming books that are related to subjects we discussed today. One is the book called Designed to Live: Everyday Inventions from a Refugee Camp, that is coming out with MIT Press in September, and that will document stories like that fountain from Azra refugee camp, voices of refugees and from their perspective, and drawn into scenes and kind of claims for a better aid and to support the living culture of displaced people. Thanks to many MIT students and Jordanian colleagues who collaborated with our team on this project. And also the book that is already out on the market, Architecture of Coexistence, Building Pluralism, that I edited and produced with the generous help of the Aga Khan Award, that features the 3 winning projects that received the Aga Khan Award in Europe: the White Mosque in Visoko, Superkilen Park in Copenhagen in Denmark, and the Islamic cemetery in Alta that I spoke about a little bit, that showcase the power of architecture to bring people together and to nurture and literally build pluralism on the ground. I think it is possible. These projects have proven that it is possible, and thanks to the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, this voice of architects and the communities can be disseminated, and this book is one vehicle. We're happy to do that also through a conversation with scholars from different disciplines that are featured in the book. I thank you all for attention, and now we will turn to Q&A. I will stop sharing.
Thank you both for those wonderful presentations. We have a number of questions in the chat, so hopefully it's okay if we run over time just a little bit, maybe 10, 15 minutes. So I'll start with one of the first ones in the chat, which was around the role of technology. So how and in what ways does technology come into play when thinking about architecture and living heritage? And it wasn't directed to anyone in particular, so whoever would feel ready to answer that, please. Go ahead.
That's an Azra question for sure.
I think you guys are technology. Well, I think it's a tool like any other. I mean, technologies and these refugees produce their own technologies, right? And so I think we need to move from this kind of techno-optimist idea that like technology and documenting and surveying these refugees will kind of be a part of the solution. The technology itself can be a helpful tool, but it will not, it's what you do with it that is providing support. So the content and approach is important, and technology can be a really helpful tool, but I would be wary of kind of spectacularization of technology. There is, especially in the context of cultural destruction and the kind of documenting what has been destroyed in Syria, for example, and exhibiting that in the West. We have a lot of problematic things happening around with technology, right? So you have, on the one hand, technology as a tool to enable you to document what has been destroyed much faster than it has ever been possible before. And to preserve it in more detail and share that knowledge. But on the other hand, you know, certain colonial dynamics perpetuate who owns this technology. Do Syrians get an access to it? What is it used for? What does it mean to exhibit a kind of spectacle of destruction of Palmyra in Paris? For whom is that exhibition and why? So, you know, it's really what we do with that.
I think also one has to always remember that technology is a very, very old word. It is not a new word. Yeah. Nowadays, we think of cutting edge technology, but there are many ancient technologies that are carried as intangible heritage by the refugees in the camps. And that knowledge helps to build, you know, wind tunnels, or it helps to lead water to irrigate little gardens that they might have constructed. So there's a lot of knowledge that people carry with them, and that is appropriate to their immediate reality and their immediate possibilities. And that often makes them enormously inventive to use the simplest materials in aid of improving their situation. And I think that's something that we really, really have to keep in mind, but also really honor and respect.
Absolutely. I think we could have a whole nother panel on epistemology and power dynamics around knowledge and whose knowledge is valued. The next question, maybe Dr. Al-Khamis for you, is about gender. So the tents of nomadic groups are generally owned, designed, fabricated, and constructed by women. How are your current studies on tents, or how are you currently looking at tents and recognizing, honoring, and promoting this? How are you relating this history to contemporary women in architecture? And how does your interest in this tradition encourage women to enter architecture? So a few different questions in there, all wrapped up into one.
Yes, and I mean this, the research into tentage and the research into the surviving ethnology of tents, of course, is something that is not a specialism of our museum, because our collection is really based on Islamic art. But I do know that there are experts at universities and in some ethnographic museums as well that specialize in these kind of continuing traditions. And what I would say in this respect is that the women play a very central role, not only in the construction of the tents, but in the lived heritage of the tent. And when I see the dynamism and the inventiveness and the determination of the women in the refugee camps and in traditional areas of the region to keep their family going, to lead the family from within, as it were, there is again a lot of inspiration to be had, because the image of women in the region, and in particular those associated with mobile architectures, tend to be that they are silent, that they are oppressed, that they do not have a voice, that they do not have a role. And that could not be further from the truth. Within their immediate contexts, whether they are regular, how shall I say, normal contexts, or whether they are the context of displacement and refugee existence, it is very often the women who are the glue of the families and the neighborhoods in the camps but also the ones who drive the agenda. And Azra can talk about this from much more recent and in-depth experience. Azra, do you want to speak a little bit about your experience with the women in the camps and your collaborations with them, and perhaps also in Sharjah?
Sure. So, well, given the lack of community spaces, it is actually really hard for women to carve out spaces for themselves. So some of these NGOs that offer spaces for craftsmanship become a kind of spaces for women, where and otherwise men are kind of present in the public space or in the shared spaces, and there's a general lack of space for them. But they are the ones who are kind of gathering the family, continuing the living traditions, and transmitting the knowledge. And so in the book of inventions, we were able to also, through cultural barriers, you cannot just go into someone's tent and interview them. So not every woman wants also to talk to you. So we were able to talk to only fewer women, although there are many of them who are actual inventors and are kind of powerhouses behind the scenes, right? So we tried to bring out those voices, but only to the extent that people felt comfortable with, right? So, because otherwise you are projecting your own kind of ideas onto them. Yeah, I think one can do much more. I mean, this is not to criticize humanitarian organizations. I think these are extraordinarily difficult conditions to work in, and everyone is trying their best. What I've seen, I mean, there is exploitation, but there is so many wonderful people driven by kind of human kindness and desire to do something good in the world. And you can't really pay that, even though it's a well-paid job. You have to have a good heart to actually do this kind of job as a humanitarian. But I think much more can be done to create spaces for women empowerment, and a lot of investments are going in that direction, thankfully, but we'll see what this. I hope that some of these projects help point at the way where opportunities are.
And they often drive the creativity in the homes as well, right? I mean, a lot of the tent panel projects that you were involved in really involved the women's dynamism and creativity, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. They were amazing. First kind of, because in the camp, people they try to do something that, what do you expect? And as if they are kind of obedient paid worker to do something. And this is a kind of power constellation that happens. But once what we usually do is to change the way things are done, change the way we sit. We are not a delegation that comes in, but people are kind of sitting together and collaborating. And then something happens, and when you incite people for creativity and give them the voice, it's just incredible what happens. And you saw in some of the designs, I mean, they were at the beginning, they were like, am I doing this correctly? And at the end, like, okay, forget about these sewing instructions. This is what we are doing. And how about this? And how about that? And sometimes, it helps to have prototypes. That's why we design prototypes, to bring them in, but not as a kind of, this is how you should do it, but as a kind of inspirational incentive. And so I came with a couple of prototypes to the camp, and once they produced their own panels and we transformed their sewing room into this kind of tent environment, everyone was completely wowed, and they saw what they could do. And that's definitely a power of art, to bring people together, but also really to inspire and connect. We have some nice questions.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up prototyping, because we actually have one about prototyping. Maybe you can expand on the last comment you just made. From a process and methods perspective, tell us more about the importance of prototyping in your work and the challenges of working with vulnerable populations like internally displaced persons.
It's a very good question. I mean, on the prototyping, I see, there's the designerly, the kind of fabrication of these materials and that type of prototyping and how and who makes these decisions. And on the other hand, the prototyping of the ethics. I mean, before doing this project, I mean, we were kind of naive going in there, just thinking, okay, we have skills, what can we do? And we want to help, and had no idea about the humanitarian realm. But working with many collaborators on the ground, it became very clear that, ethical concerns are many and need to be taken into account. And for actually the first 2 years, my team and I were completely frozen by ethical concerns. We were, because whatever you do, you cannot escape the power dynamics that you and biases that you inevitably bring in. Just the fact that we can leave the camp and they cannot is already like an ethical problem. But the way I managed to move away from that was to say, okay, the world is an unjust place. Like, what is the alternative? Do nothing and live my happy life at MIT and not use my skill? Well, like, where do I put my skill as an artist? Can I use maybe this position that I have and skills that I have? And also these students and people who want to do something but don't know how to and where to plug in. So that helped. And what we did in parallel, so there is the creative process, but there is a kind of prototyping of what we called code of ethics. Initially, the idea was to create a code, and this is something that could be helpful to designers and to follow. But then, of course, run into the question, like, who decides what is ethical? It is also very culturally specific and different. What is ethical in the US is not in the camp. And so what came out of that was a series of conversations before any kind of collaborations. There was first this type of discussion about the approach, what are people bringing to the table, how we will do it, who is doing what, and with what interest, and what are people getting out of it, and are people paid, and what does all that imply and mean. And I think that was really important, and it was also multi-directional, so with inputs from Syrian refugees, from humanitarian organizations, host community members, everyone, journalists, everyone brings a different skills and different perspective. So that was really important. And then the other prototyping is important. I mean, I kind of run in parallel with my team, who are, architects, designers, textile artists at MIT, who the prototypes that we bring in, where we test the functionality of these fabrics, but also, we even did kind of transdisciplinary collaboration to see, is this at all, could this also be a functional project and beyond just the kind of drawing on the traditional tents, but could there be a kind of insulatory property of these shock blankets embedded in the panels? So all of these things are running as research components in parallel, and they serve in the exhibition as a model of how one could think about the kind of humanitarian aid from these multiple dimensions. Not necessarily as a solution, but this tent project is a prototype for collaboration across borders, and a model for that, as a model of translating historical forms into contemporary design, as also prototype for transforming and upcycling trash and into something that could be useful, and so on. So very important is the prototyping, but I see it really this kind of the ethical and methodological and the kind of material component and craftsmanship are the other part.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question, so I'll give you all a choice. One that came through the chat is around play, because Dr. Akšamija, you actually just mentioned again the toys that were produced out of trash from the Syrian refugees that were helping them remember where they came from, envision a future. And the Aga Khan Museum also has an exhibit coming up on the state of play. So wondering if you can both comment on the role of play in living heritage. So that is your first option. Your other option is, 20 years from now, if the three of us are having this webinar again, we're reunited, what will we be celebrating as we discuss living heritage, as you envision it? Not an easy choice, but I'll leave it to you.
I like the play question. Ulrike.
I like the last question, and it's easily answered. You know, if we are lucky enough to meet again in 30 years' time, I mean, I will be very decrepit by then. But what we will be celebrating will be the human spirit, will be the human spirit to overcome, and will be love. Because fundamentally, what we have seen over the last year and a half with this unprecedented, at least in our lifetimes, global crisis, is the determination of human beings to love each other and to overcome together. And arts and culture actually have played a very, very central existential role in this overcoming together. So many people have turned to the arts, and I mean the arts in the widest sense of the word. You know, cooking is also an art. Have turned to the arts for therapy, for solace, for imagining a better future. And it really has shown us who work in the sector how crucial our work actually is, and therefore how much we have to respect it and contemplate it in being of service. So that is what I look forward to celebrating in 30 years' time: humanity and the spirit to love and to overcome.
So beautiful. Thank you, Ulrike. Well, I'll add the answer maybe to the play question. And we have covered both. I think in these moments of absolute disparity and existential crisis, it's play that brings joy to life. You know, when I was in Palestine, I learned from the art students there. They were saying, you know, it's the play that help us kind of overcome the occupation. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, if you kind of accept that the occupation dominates your life, you have to liberate your mind, the occupation of the mind. And they do that with play. It's a really powerful vehicle. And you saw it also in the refugee camp, that image of the Syrian man who is known as a Santa Claus of the Azra camp. His name is Abu Zuhair. This man is he's just pure joy. You know, he just makes toys out of trash. And I mean, he's not selling this. This is just something that he does out of pure love to bring joy to our future heritage and the children of the camp, and to show them that they can transform any obstacle that they are facing into something that is joyful and make life worth living. And he does that out of nothing, out of trash. And he is an example for all of us, I think.
It is, yeah, absolutely. And it is also a very important tool to learn about conflict resolution. Because if you play in a group, there are rules that you make up or that you have to adhere to, that you have to navigate, mitigate. And these rules, of course, are there to make the game successful, joyous, but there's always an underlying potential for conflict that you have to be aware of and that you have to respect as you want to go ahead and win the game or whatever. And we have the State of Play exhibition in the museum. It just opened, actually, and we are exploring this multi-dimensional potential of play, as you say, you know, as an expression of the imagination and of joy, but also how to navigate the potential of conflict that comes with play. And it was enormously fascinating to me the other day. Our summer camps in the museum this year are actually themed around that exhibition. And the artists actually came in and also worked with the kids and explained the installation that they did in our atrium. And one day, some of the kids were playing with hoops, one of the 4 playthings that form the basis of this exhibition. And there was a conflict emerging because the group of kids that was playing didn't have enough hoops, and they started wrangling. And a little boy saw what was happening in front of his eyes, and he walked up to the kids and gave up his hoop in order to resolve the conflict. And I said to the educators, I said, you have to write this story down, because do you realize how profound this moment is? Because at this moment, this little boy saw a conflict and stepped in to become a peacemaker. And that was a very instinctive reaction, but it was also a very important learning that you have the power to make a positive difference in a moment of conflict and crisis. So playing also teaches you about peacemaking and avoiding conflict. So sometimes you have concepts that seem so very, very simple, but when you contemplate them, you see that there's a profound significance in them.
Beautiful. I'm so delighted, Ulrike, that you have become the new director of the Aga Khan Museum. It's just hearing you speak is so inspiring, and I'm really excited to see what new exhibitions are coming out in the museum. And I hope there will be also some collaborations with us in Boston.
Absolutely, looking forward to it, because I think our mandates are the same. You know, we bridge cultures through the arts, and our ultimate aim is, you know, to make the world a better place. So I very much look forward to our next collaborations.
What a beautiful sentiment to end on, and so in line with the ethos of pluralism of the award and of the institutions that you both represent. So Dr. Akšamija, Dr. Al-Khamis, thank you so much for engaging in this discussion and for the extra time that you shared with us today. And our audience, thank you for your questions and insights and active participation. This concludes our Architecture and Dialogue series, which would not have been possible without our partners at the BSA. In particular, I would like to thank Polly Carpenter, Taylor Johnson, and Paige McWhorter. I'd also like to recognize Marianne Fenton from the Aga Khan Museum, Celine Martineau from the Aga Khan Award, Dr. Nasser Rabat from MIT for their support, as well as President Al-Karim Alidina, Jenny Datu, and the Communications and Publications team of the Aga Khan Council USA. You can find today's recording and all of the previous webinars in the series on the BSA website. I think we've dropped the link in the chat as well. Thank you once again, and good night.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.